Okay, so now that we've got that first unit of stuff out of the way and we have all of our ecological background and all of our chemical toxicological background up to speed now, we can finally embark on some special directed topics. So the remainder of the semester is going to be focused on going in depth into particular environmental toxicological concepts. So I've divided the remaining 2/3 of the semester, half-ish of the semester, into we're going to first talk about some human-caused ecological environmental toxicological issues, and then we're going to see kind of the environment strikes back with some environmental caused environmental toxicological issues. So we're going to begin our special units with talking about PFAS. How many folks have heard of PFAS before you saw it posted on this slide? One person-ish. Okay, so welcome to PFAS. PFAS is going to be one of the biggest environmental toxicological challenges of the coming century, I would say. This is going to be a really critical topic. Okay, so what are PFAS? PFAS, however you choose to pronounce that A, it doesn't particularly matter. But PFAS stands for per and poly fluoroalkyl substances. So the P in PFAS can stands for per and poly. So per and poly is both encompassed within the P of PFAS. Fluoroalkyl, F is the fluoral, A is the alkyl, and S is the substances. So PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are synthetic, i.e. xenobiotic, i.e. anthropogenic compounds. They are organic in that they follow a carbon backbone, and they are typically saturated with fluorine. So where with a normal organic molecule chain, you might expect it to be saturated with hydrogens, we are instead saturated with fluorines. There can be other functional groups stuck in there. There can be branches to that carbon backbone. But generally speaking, it's a carbon backbone that is saturated with fluorines. It's based on this alkyl chain, right? The alkyl. So if, for those of you who haven't had organic chemistry yet, this is what an alkyl chain looks like, where you usually have, you begin your alkyl chain with some methyl group, and then it's just some series of repeating carbons after it for however long those carbons go. So the N there stands for some unknown number of carbons continuing on after that chain. And normally in a typical organic molecule, all of those carbons would be fully saturated with hydrogens, but instead in PFAS, we are fully saturating with fluorines. You can have other things on there, as I mentioned. The EPA states that to be considered a PFAS compound, you need to have at least one fully fluorinated methyl group somewhere. That methyl group can be in the middle, it can be at the end, it can be all of them, doesn't matter, just at least one. It's got to be fully fluorinated, meaning that every possible spot that could be taken up by a hydrogen or some other functional group is all fluorines. And it is typically fluorines, no other halogens. So bromines, chlorines, none of that, only fluorines. PFAS have been around for quite some time. They were, oh, sorry, I forgot that I had that here. So our alkyl chain chemical definition is this, where for every carbon you have 2 hydrogens plus 1 more. Yeah, which we can also sort of write as this. Okay, back to where I thought I was in my train of thought. All right, so PFAS have been with us for a long time. PFAS were originally developed, some of the first compounds come to us from the 30s, specifically in 1938, and the very first PFAS compound that was sort of introduced to the world populace was Teflon. So Teflon is the original PFAS molecule. How many folks grew up with a Teflon pan in their household? So those non-stick cooking pans, they're usually black. They kind of looked, they weren't smooth, but they were kind of, they weren't smooth, but they weren't rough either. And somehow magically, like nothing stuck to them. And now we have all of these ceramic and diamond coated whatever that are not Teflon, but most folks had a Teflon pan in their house until about 15 years ago. Teflons were pretty common. I know I still have a couple of old Teflon pans banging around. I know my parents do. And lots of folks do. The next time you go home, maybe over Thanksgiving, rummage through the pan drawer, and if you see those black coated frying pans or the cook pots that are non-stick, they're probably Teflon. So Teflon was accidentally invented in 1938, and we realized how good it was at things not sticking to it, and it quickly became very, very popular. Fast forward to a little bit more modern and purposeful PFAS. One of the main things that PFAS are really, really good at is fire suppression, fire retardation, fire control, because of their whole non-stick thing. And also they're not terribly flammable, and they tend to block out oxygen really well. So they're used a lot in fire suppression, fire retardation. And that's where we see most of their applications today. They're used in all sorts of things, though, as we will see. So PFAS are still with us today, and we're still making them, we're still using them, but now definitely with an eye of caution. So when we talk about PFAS, this is a very large family of compounds. Most of them are resistant to all sorts of really severe situations. They're resistant to heat, hence their fire suppression. They are incredibly polar, right? Because fluorines are, right, that's a charged atom usually. Usually a lot of charge comes with atoms, and so oil doesn't like to react with all those fluorines. But at the same time, if you get a whole bunch of fluorines together and they're all covalently bonded to carbons, then you kind of neutralize them a little bit. And so water doesn't want to react with them either. So PFAS don't react with water. They also don't react with oil. So on our whole spectrum of lipophilic to lipophobic or hydrophobic to hydrophilic, they are an odd duck because they like nothing. PFAS don't like anything. So they're used often for waterproofing. We see them in waterproofing. We see them, here's just a very short list of these compounds. So we use PFAS to waterproof fabrics because PFAS doesn't like water. The original Gore-Tex formulation used forms of PFAS in them. They are often used in stain-resistant fabrics. So Scotchgard is a PFAS. If you have a couch or sofa that is advertised as stain-resistant or stain resistant is usually the phrase. It's because of PFAS and it is stain resistant. Firefighting foam is one of the main things, as we'll see. Cosmetics, all of those sweat-proof cosmetics that don't come off your face when you're swimming, they don't come off your face no matter how hard you're working out in the gym. That's PFAS doing that. If you are able to squeeze every last drop of foundation out of a tube, it's probably because that tube was lined with PFAS to make the cosmetic inside not stick to the inside of the tube. Same with personal care products. This could be everything from shampoos and conditioners to soaps to lotions. So it can be in the products themselves, or it can be in the packaging to make sure that you get all of the packaging out of them, or all of the product out of the packaging. Same with food packaging. One of the most notorious food packaging places where we see PFAS employed is microwave popcorn. So if you like microwave popcorn, you are enjoying PFAS, and you like your microwave popcorn to not stick to the inside of the bag, thanks to PFAS. All sorts of other technology, because they are resistant to oil, water, and heat. They're really good at insulating semiconductors and making sure that all of computer processing runs smoothly. Furniture, again, usually in the form of stain resistance and other properties. And all told, through all of these different categories, I don't expect you guys to know all of these different categories, but across all of these, there are several thousand different forms. People have really kind of stopped counting how many different forms of PFAS exist. Some, depending on how you define what exactly a compound that is considered a PFAS is, we're up into the millions. If you have a very strictly limited, like it must be fully saturated with fluorines, then we're in a couple of thousand different forms of PFAS that currently exist. So there's a lot of them out there doing a lot of things. And you thought biologists were crazy about their nomenclature. Chemists are also crazy about their nomenclature as well. And so PFAS have their own hierarchy and taxonomic nomenclature to help organize them. But we're not going to get into that. Okay, everybody good here? All right, so there are two very common forms of PFAS that get a lot of attention that I do want you guys to know. So these two forms of PFAS that get widely used are PFOSs and PFOAs. So PFOS is this perfluorooctansulfonic acid. So it's this long polycarbon chain here that is fully saturated with fluorines, and the functional group on the end, instead of being a methyl group, is a sulfate group. Here's that fully fluorinated methyl group at the tail. So we see PFOS used a lot in firefighting foam, fabric treatments, and this one gets used in semiconductors to help make everything work smoothly. PFOAs, perfluorooctanic acid. This one has sort of your standard carboxyl group at the end. Here's that fully fluorinated methyl group again. It's slightly shorter than PFOS, so not as many carbons in the chain. And we see this again in firefighting foam. We see PFOA in a lot of surfactant sort of situations. So industrial soaps, really good at forming micelles. We see it in insulation, and we see it in where we want there to be some sort of waxed surface. So here's that food packaging, those microwave popcorn bags, milk cartons, etc. The EPA, and this is a hyperlink so that you can go read all about what the EPA has done. Since just this past year, the EPA has finally targeted 5 specific compounds of PFASs for removal from public drinking water. So remember, again, there are thousands of these different kinds of compounds, but the EPA has finally established limits on 5 of them. So PFOS and PFOA, the new EPA target for these is 4 parts per trillion. I chose to write out parts per trillion because I didn't want people to be confused with parts per thousand, PPT, because I'm not quite sure how you abbreviate parts per trillion to make it distinct from parts per thousand, and I didn't want there to be confusion. So parts per trillion, meaning in a trillion molecules of public drinking water, 4 of them can be a PFOS or a PFOA, not both. For these other particular compounds, other common PFASs, these are up to 10 parts per trillion. You can have 10 parts per trillion of these guys. What these particular compounds are, we're not going to quite get into. We're going to really focus on PFOSs and PFOAs as our standard bearers for PFAS. But these are also PFAS compounds that the EPA is cracking down on. You can read all about that here if you want to know more. No, separately. Yes. No, it's separate for each of them. So you can have so you could have 4 parts PFOSs and 4 parts. So grand total of 8, I suppose. Grand total of 30 here. One of the challenges to following this EPA rule that that the public drinking water community is currently contending with is that most water municipalities don't have equipment that can test at the part per trillion level. Most water quality testing equipment really only goes down to parts per billion. So it's really, really hard to measure this parts per trillion. And so one of the big challenges to implementing this new EPA rule is finding the testing infrastructure that's actually going to be able to detect at the level of parts per trillion. That's going to be the challenge of this. All right, everybody good? Okay. All right, so PFAS or PFAS have been found all over the world. PFAS have been detected on every continent, in every ocean. Every human sample that they've looked for PFAS, they've found it. Every animal sample that they've looked for PFAS, they've found it. Every plant that they've looked for PFAS, they've found it. So PFAS are the definition of ubiquitously distributed. They are literally everywhere. And one of the really concerning things about the distribution of PFAS is that there are not that many places that make PFAS. And yet we find them everywhere in the most remote corners of the earth. We find them in Antarctica. We find them at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. We find them on the top of Mount Everest. We find them everywhere. The reason we find them everywhere, no matter how near or far to a manufacturing center, is because these chemicals do not break down. These are the compounds, if you've ever heard reference to forever chemicals, PFAS are the forever chemicals. So we talked about how some compounds can be broken down by UV degradation. Some compounds can be broken down just through exposure to dry air. Some compounds, once you ingest them, you have enzymes in your body that can attack them and break them down. No organism can break them down with their metabolism. No amount of UV exposure will break them down. No amount of exposure to water will break them down. They do not decompose into any smaller bits. And so because PFAS don't break down, once a PFAS molecule exists, it exists in that form in perpetuity. We can actually follow PFAS compounds through a biogeochemical cycle, just like we can carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and silica and all of the other elemental things that we are concerned about at the biogeochemical level. So a lot of times PFAS begin their life in some sort of manufacturing plant, and PFAS can escape in exhaust to contaminate air and affect near and far cities. And so you can breathe it in and you get PFAS in you that way. Or you can ingest it through your food. So as the PFAS settles out of the air and onto farmland, it can be taken up by those plants that we then consume, or those animals that ate those plants that we then consume. Or it's lining the packaging of other plants or of other food products that we then consume. What that PFAS can then, it'll circulate through our bodies, and eventually some of it will make it out through various excretion routes where it goes into wastewater, often gets circulated back through wastewater into water treatment plants where it becomes drinking water again, and we ingest it all over again. It can escape from landfills. So when we throw out that packaging, it will go into a landfill. It can leak and escape out through that landfill, make it back into aerosol routes, make it back into water routes, make it back into soil routes that go back into the food cycle. So once PFAS have escaped into an environment, they're there. There's no getting them out. They are forever chemicals. All right. So any and all routes are possible routes of exposure to PFAS if we're thinking of our sort of 5 steps of how an organism experiences a toxic substance, right? Ingestion, action, storage, metabolism, excretion, if we're thinking of those 5 steps. When we go back to the ingestion, I changed ingestion to just introduction because you can be introduced to PFAS in any number of ways. So humans are exposed to PFAS through air quality, treated materials, packaging, directly through food, directly from soil, directly from water, etc. So PFAS are ubiquitous. They are pretty much everywhere. When we think about inhalation, we are thinking about particulates usually. So particulates can come to us through either direct manufacturing processes or the processing of waste. So one type of waste management that exists is called cogeneration. And cogeneration is where garbage that would normally sort of go to a municipal dump is instead burned in a furnace. And that furnace is used to heat water, that is used to spin a turbine, that is used to generate electricity. So the burning of garbage by heating water spins a turbine, generates electricity. So the burning of garbage is often used as a way to generate electricity by not burning fossil fuels or mining for fossil fuels. But the exhaust waste of that cogeneration garbage burning can release PFAS particulates into the air. Additionally, other activities such as agriculture, the churning of soil often creates dust. That dust can contain PFAS, can get into the air. Even just general activities. The paper that I have selected for us to read along with this is looking at the application of, or it's looking at the relationship between ski wax. Anybody here ski or do winter sports? All right, so for those of you who do winter sports or are aware that winter sports exist, and that skis and snowboards and whatnot need to be waxed so that they go smoothly over the snow, a lot of those waxes contain PFAS, the whole non-stick thing, the whole water-resistant thing makes them really good in ski waxes. This paper is looking at the aerosolization of those PFASs from ski wax and the ultimate deposition of the PFAS onto pine needles. That's the paper that we're going to read as a companion to this. So inhalation comes from a particulate. We can get those particulates in many ways. We can ingest this food packaging in food directly, as I've mentioned. And we can also absorb it through our skin. So from clothing, so if you are wearing waterproof, water-resistant, stain-resistant clothing that has PFAS on it, it is directly touching your skin. You can absorb it through your skin. If you have personal care products, I put on lotion right before this class. I probably dosed myself with PFAS. So there are lots of ways that we can be introduced to PFAS. If we want to think about the action, so you've been exposed to PFAS. So what? What happens? We're going to talk about the action of PFAS. PFAS can exist in your system for about 4 to 5 years. That's the blood serum half-life. That's about how long it takes for the compound to kind of just work its way through before you just excrete it out, again, whole, because we can't really do a whole lot to it. There is no one mechanism for how PFAS can interact with the human body. So PFAS has been shown to be an endocrine disruptor, meaning that it messes with hormone signaling. It has been shown to be hepatotoxic, meaning that it can affect your liver function by attacking liver cells and degrading the function of your liver cells. It has been shown to be carcinogenic, both through tumor genesis and also as a genetic mutagen. Excuse me. And it has been shown to have inflammatory properties. So it can increase general overall inflammation, hypertension, other inflammatory mechanisms. So there are lots of particular effects that PFAS can have. So the way this diagram is labeled, solid lines have pretty high certainty relationships to PFAS. Dotted lines have lower certainty. So thyroid disease has been shown to be a consistent issue. Increased cholesterol levels, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, has been shown to be a consistent issue. Less support for breast cancer. Breast cancer tends to be a complicated and sticky wicket. So no one's terribly surprised that PFAS may be implicated there, but we're still learning and figuring out that connection. Liver disease, liver damage, kidney cancer. We're still kind of learning the inflammatory pathways. High support for testicular cancer, and lots of low certainty relationships to neonatal or effects to fetal development if a woman is exposed to PFAS. So lots of issues potentially going on in the human body with PFAS. As I mentioned, there's a lot of work going on with figuring out the exact action of PFAS. Do I need to go back? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard a gasp. So one of the main issues that we tend to notice with people is this condition of hypercholesterolemia. Sorry, can't say this one. Hypercholesterolemia, or anemia, like anemia, but anemia. And this condition is often associated with elevated LDL cholesterol measurements. So remember LDL, that's your low density lipids, that's the bad cholesterol. opposed to high density lipids are the, right? Yeah. Low density is bad, high density good. Okay. I always want to make sure I got that right. Yeah, so LDL, bad. So elevated LDL goes up with increased exposure to PFAS. One mechanism that we are currently finding out more about is that PFAS can interact with this receptor called a peroxisome proliferator activated receptor. So PPAR, a PPAR receptor. So when PFAS interact with these receptors, they reduce the effectiveness of these receptors on downstream gene expression. So these PAR receptors, PPAR receptors, are particularly nuclear receptors. So we find PPAR receptors in the nuclear envelope. And they are important in gene regulation, so they act directly on DNA. These receptors are particularly important in cellular differentiation, cellular development, and tumor genesis. These receptors are also really important in the expression of genes related to our metabolism, hence, which is the connection to this elevated level of LDL, right? If we're not able to metabolize, so if we're not able to metabolize because these receptors, sorry, I'll use the pointer on the thing so that it gets recorded. So if these receptors are blocked by a PFAS, right? So instead of this fatty acid being the ligand to this receptor, it would be a PFAS that is now the ligand to this receptor. But because the PFAS kind of looks like a fatty acid, doesn't quite work like a fatty acid, it gets stuck. So these receptors will latch on to the PFAS and then become stuck, and that inactivates them. So because they are then inactivated, they don't continue on to actually turn on the expression of genes that would be involved in cellular differentiation, development, inhibit tumorigenesis, and also increase our metabolism. So with these PPAR receptors inhibited, basically, this downregulates our metabolism, and this causes a buildup of LDL cholesterol in our blood serum because we are not metabolizing it because receptors aren't turning on the genes to help us metabolize it. Does that make sense? Ish? Okay. So here's a quick study that I found to help explain some of this. So this study and a couple of other ones very similar to it are suggesting that the lipophilic nature of the PFAS molecules helps them to strongly bind to these PPAR receptors, but then they cannot be disengaged, and that inactivates them, and that causes all of these downstream cascading effects. That's one of the things that we think is happening with PFAS to cause a lot of these issues that we see in humans. All right, so just to close the loop here on our 5 steps of interactions of PFAS. So our metabolism, we just talked about how our metabolism is affected and downregulated due to those PFAS molecules inhibiting the PPAR receptors. In terms of storage, so again, these molecules do exhibit some lipophilic properties, and so they tend to follow the storage pathway of a lot of other lipophilic compounds. And so they can be stored in your fatty tissues, and then as you metabolize your fatty tissue, you can liberate and release more PFAS. And then finally, excretion, again, due to lack of metabolism. So we're not breaking these things down. We don't, our monooxygenase enzymes and our CYP450s can't do anything with this. They can't seem to break a wedge in there and add some hydroxyl groups and make it able to break down. So we don't do any metabolism on them. And so when we excrete them whole. As our metabolic waste then goes through the wastewater treatment system and the municipal waste system, they can escape those places and enter ecosystems, therefore unaltered. And we begin the PFAS cycle all over again. All right, everybody okay? Yeah, no? Okay. So you may be wondering how else, other than just directly burning waste, how can PFAS escape something like a landfill? If you've never looked at the anatomy of a landfill, here is what that anatomy looks like. So here is our landfill. So basically you go and you dig a hole somewhere and you line that hole with something called the liner system. And I know that this diagram is a little low resolution and you can't read all this, but safe to say, the liner system isn't just, some plastic tarp that you lay down in the bottom of this hole. It's actually several layers of plastic. Not only several layers of plastic, but also pipes to catch any liquids that seep through. And these pipes often go to detection and sensor wells that people can test regularly for the ratio of water, other compounds, methane gases that are coming out of the waste that's sitting on top of this liner system. So there are several layers involved in a liner system that are meant to prevent things in the landfill from escaping into either the groundwater below or the soil below. So you have your liner system and then you fill it up with waste. And then when you've decided that your hole is full of waste, you then cap it. So capping involves laying down another series of plastic boundaries. You lay down another series of plastic boundaries, you put soil over all of those plastic boundaries, and then you often plant it with grass or some other vegetation to keep that soil that you've just put over that landfill cap in place. This is generally a pretty good system. If you've ever driven, how many folks have driven on the 190 north? So you cross through Grand Island and you're now into Niagara Falls. You come down off the Grand Island Bridge and you're heading into Niagara Falls. And you're continuing on past that exit that goes straight to Niagara Falls, like you're going to the outlet malls. All right, so you go past Niagara Falls and you go towards the outlet malls and there's all these hills. That's a landfill that's been capped. And so as you look at those hills now, so that this is a appropriately taken care of landfill, but as you look at that green hill, notice all of the pipes just kind of coming out of it. That's those testing wells that you would see to make sure that the liner system is working, that everything is working just as it should be. As you drive down the thruway, if you see this beautiful, like weird green hill with all these pipes coming out of it, it's a landfill. That's what all those green hills are. So generally these landfills work pretty well. But shit happens and PFAS can still escape from landfills and these other waste disposal systems. This is how landfill protection is meant to work in a perfect world. However, we do not live in a perfect world. Nothing is forever except for forever chemicals. These liners can break down. So these liners, right, if they're 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, they're going to experience some breakdown. This is a lot of weight pressing on these liners, compacting them. All of that pressure, time, seepage, corrosion can eventually break and wear down these liners. So PFAS can escape through breakdown in liners. If the cap is not sturdy enough, you can get breakdown in the cap, especially if you're in maybe a flood zone or you've experienced a torrential hurricane that washed away some of this, especially if you just sort of freshly capped it. Like imagine fresh dirt over something. That dirt is not secure in any way, shape, or form. Even if you laid popped a layer of sod grass over it, that brand new dirt is not secure, and then it gets hit with a hurricane or flash flood or something, and away it goes. If a cap is, 5, 10, 20 years old, it's probably pretty secure and you're not too worried about it. But a brand new cap, I would be worried about that. You could test this at surrounding wells to see if your breakdown is happening and you're able to test for escaping PFAS. One of the more common ways that PFAS can escape from landfills is simply through using cheap materials, insufficient materials, or if just insufficient testing is used, right? So municipalities are always looking for ways to cut corners. City budgets are tight, town budgets are tight. And if you were faced with spending a lot of money on all of these layers, it is not unreasonable to ask, can we get away without one of them? Like, can we cut a corner and not have one of these layers? We have to have all of these layers. There's supposed to be laws in place to make sure that you can't do that. But especially in small communities, out of the way communities where observation is less, that kind of skimping tends to happen a little bit more frequently. So escape from landfills is one of the most common ways that PFAS can be reintroduced into the PFAS cycle and into ecosystems. All right. There are currently a lot of lawsuits involving PFAS. We're not going to talk about every single lawsuit. I'm just going to highlight a couple of important ones. So one that's currently going on right now is there's a large class action lawsuit regarding exposure to PFAS by military service members at military bases across the country. The primary route of exposure to PFAS at military bases is through the use of firefighting foam. So that's the photo that we started with, and also this one here. So this is fire suppression foam. This is at one of the military bases in one of these class action lawsuits. This is in 2013. So this is PFAS containing foam. In the class action lawsuit, includes over 600,000 service members that have been exposed to PFAS either directly or indirectly through either firefighting foam, washing up and cleaning up after firefighting foam, drinking well water contaminated with PFAS by firefighting foam, all of those kinds of situations. The Department of Defense, so DoD stands for Department of Defense, observed PFAS in drinking water supplies at over 70 parts per trillion at least 24 bases. Some of the most noteworthy findings from that DoD study included the Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point in North Carolina with its contaminated groundwater. And so here's Cherry Point hosing down a training fire. And you can see that there's just green in the background. So when they go to clean all this up, it just gets hosed off the runway. Fort Leavenworth in Kansas had the highest PFAS concentration in their drinking water at 649 parts per trillion. Remember, the EPA just set a limit of 4 and 10. So 600 times the new EPA limit. Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Fort Bragg is the largest Army base in the country. It had drinking water PFAS at 98 parts per trillion. And many of the lawsuits are asking for damages. So monetary compensation for loss of life, loss of ability, recompense for medical treatments that you may have had. They want the VA to cover any of those medical treatments, either they're going forward or even retroactive to any of the illnesses. So this is really setting up to be a very similar fight to convincing the VA to cover a lot of the diseases and cancers and issues that we saw come out of Iraq with Iraq War Syndrome and those kind of things. A lot of the bills that were ultimately pushed through Congress to cover the medical treatment of police and firefighters and citizens who suffered illnesses due to 9/11, right? There's all of these kind of, we don't know what's going to happen, but we need to make sure something's going to be in place to cover this that's trying to be wrapped up in these lawsuits. And that's one of the reasons why these lawsuits can take so long, is because you don't know exactly what someone is going to come down with. And so it's hard to write, it's hard for lawyers to negotiate and come to an agreement about a settlement that it encompasses a whole bunch of unknowns. Like nobody wants to agree to, I don't know, whatever happens, right? No one's going to agree to that. So you have to kind of walk that line between, well, we have to articulate some things, but we can't articulate everything because we want to leave some wiggle room. And that's where a lot of these lawsuits are right now. A closer to home lawsuit involving PFAS comes to us from the town of Hoosick Falls. So Hoosick Falls is a little town on the Hudson River, pretty close to the Vermont border, south of Lake Champlain. And in 2016, they began a class action suit against a number of companies, Saint-Gobain, Honeywell, 3M, and DuPont. So how many folks have heard of Honeywell? some folks have heard of Honeywell. Most people know them for like their air filters and things, but they do a lot of chemical manufacturing. Saint-Gobain, I hadn't heard of until I started reading into this. Has anyone else heard of Saint-Gobain? Okay. 3M, has anyone heard of 3M? 3M, this is Scotch tape, Post-it notes, all sorts of sticky adhesive stuffs. And DuPont. Most people are aware of DuPont. We have several DuPont plants around here. So these companies all operated chemical plants adjacent to the water treatment facility in the town of Hoosick Falls. And those companies contaminated groundwater with PFOA specifically. So this is specifically over the compound PFOA, that subgroup of PFASs, or that subcompound in PFASs. So these companies were using PFAS, specifically PFOA. Their disposal treatment was contaminating groundwater. That groundwater leaked into the wells that the water treatment facility was pulling for municipal water supply. And we believe, or the lawsuit alleges, that this contamination goes back to the 50s. So this contamination began in the 50s and continued forward until sometime in the early 2000s, mid 2010s. In 2021 is when this lawsuit was concluded. So this class action lawsuit is done, and $65 million in damages were awarded to the citizens of Hoosick Falls. Within that award, within this $65 million, they get 10 years of medical monitoring. They get treatment for conditions associated with PFOA. They're also going to be recompensated for decreased property values, which I thought was a unique thing to include in a class action lawsuit, right? Because like Hoosick Falls is now pretty well known as everything here is contaminated by PFAS. Like, if you wanted to buy a home in Hoosick Falls, you'd be looking at what water system are you on? And if you're on this town's water system, you probably don't want to buy that house. So people have a hard time selling their houses and moving away to somewhere where they can get healthy. Residents, over the course of this class action suit, it came out that residents of Hoosick Falls had a blood serum concentration of PFOA in the 1.86 parts per billion. So a whole order of magnitude up from trillion, more concentrated. And there is still ongoing PFAS issues in the Hudson Valley. As I was writing this lecture, this advertisement came through my Facebook feed. This is by the New York City Riverkeeper, Hudson River Riverkeeper Association. So Newburgh, which is just down the river from Hoosick Falls, closer to New York City. But there is a PFAS issue in Newburgh that is also probably about to go through the same process as Hoosick Falls. Okay, so that's our PFAS. I did want to talk about some related compounds, which we've already talked about a little bit, but they are somewhat related, and that's PCBs. So PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, polychlorinated biphenyl compounds. They have a lot of the same chemical properties as PFAS. So they're lipophilic, they're resistant to many conditions, including heat, water, oil. They're used in a variety of products. They have a very long production history going back to the 20s and 30s as well. They also do not break down in the environment. So PCBs are a problem as well. And this is sort of, PCBs are almost another class of forever chemicals. PCBs often get lumped in with the term forever chemicals. And around here, we have quite the local history with PCBs. So one of the most important sites of contamination with PCBs was Love Canal. I've mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. Excuse me. So again, this is a hyperlink, so you can go read more about it. And this is this link goes to, I forget if it's the Buffalo Public Library or the Buffalo Historical Society, but they've got this whole sort of photo journal of photos from Love Canal. And these are just a few of them that I grabbed from this photo journal. So here is a satellite shot of before and after. I know it's weird that the color one is the before, but so in brief, what happened in Love Canal? So Love Canal, it's this little neighborhood in Niagara Falls. This is This is like this little kind of offshoot of the Niagara River. So the Niagara River is here, and then it makes this little offshoot kind of around this little thing here, and then it joins back up with the Niagara River. This highway here, this is the LaSalle Highway. If you've ever driven on the LaSalle Highway or driven by it, so you can get on the LaSalle Highway and you can drive right past this and you can go see Love Canal for yourself. But so this community of Love Canal was here. This community started, it's called Love Canal because in the late 1890s-ish, there was this guy, Love, and he had this idea to build a canal from the Niagara River to Lake Ontario so that freighters and other ships could get over Niagara Falls and commerce could happen between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. We use the Welland Canal through Ontario province for that now, but before the Welland Canal, there was Love Canal. So he started to dig this canal, and then money and interest kind of ran out, and there was just this sort of big hole in the ground that never really got finished. In the 1920s, 1930s-ish, some chemical companies set up shop there and said, hey, there's this great big hole in the ground. That's a perfect place to put our chemical waste. Where it's basically a pre-landfill that's already been dug. We don't have to do anything. Great. So they built their chemical companies, they put their chemical waste there, and then the chemical companies decided to move elsewhere, and they just sort of covered everything up. Then in the 1950s, 1960s, 50s, 60s, sometime in there, post World War II, baby boom in full swing, all these kids need somewhere to go to school. City of Niagara Falls is looking for somewhere to build schools. They need land on the cheap. And Hooker Chemical Company, who was the chemical company that owned this area at the time, was approached by the city of Niagara Falls, the city of Niagara Falls wanted to buy this land from this chemical company. And Hooker Chemical said, you know, we've been burying toxic waste there, right? Like, you know that there's chemicals. And city of Niagara Falls was like, yeah, but we need land for a school now. And we'll deal with it later. Guess what they never did? They never dealt with it later. So they bought this land and they built a school. So here's the school. And here's the school. This is like all the fields that the school had for kids to run around and play in. Here's all the homes that were built around the school so that kids could walk to school and be close to school and all that and come home for lunch and whatnot. So these are all homes around there. And yeah, and so it was this little neighborhood community. There are reports of children in like the 70s that it would rain, and you know how the ground around here gets sort of squishy and muddy when it rains because we have a lot of clay in our soil. So there were reports that when it would rain at the school, the puddles that would fill up in the yard would have this rainbow iridescent sheen to them that the kids just love jumping in, right? You jump in these puddles and you make all these rainbows, these iridescent rainbows come out of the puddles. There's all sorts of horrifically terrible stories like that. And so in the late 70s, all sorts of cancers, all sorts of birth defects, all sorts of horrible health issues started popping up. And this one particular woman, Lois Gibbs, she was the one who started organizing a lot of community involvement. She's the one who wrote to President Carter and got him to come down to Love Canal and be like, oh my God, this is disastrous here. And it was Lois Gibbs in Love Canal that convinced Carter to have Congress pass, and then he signed that CERCLA Act, which developed the Superfund. And so Love Canal is the first Superfund. And so what the Superfund did is they came and they bulldozed everything. So they bought up everybody's property, gave everyone a check, had them all moved somewhere else, and they bulldozed all the houses. So everything that you see here now is bulldozed, what used to be this. You can still see the streets are here, but there's no houses on them anymore. They've all been torn down. This giant field, this is where the school and a lot of other houses used to be. This is all just testing wells now. It was a long process of excavation to dig up all the toxic waste. This is a photo of all of the barrels of dug up soil that were barreled up as toxic waste. So this is sort of in the midst of all the cleanup. They were barreling up all this waste, and it just kind of sat here while they figured out what to do with it. So these barrels just sort of sat around for a while. And again, I think I mentioned previously, the EPA and the New York State DEC say that Love Canal is cleaned up. Their testing wells have been showing negative PCB or negative results for positive PCBs for a long time. They're not finding anything. But all of this this is still resident and occupied. So there are still people that live all around Love Canal. They just don't live actually sort of here where the worst of it was. And it's these citizens now that are saying, you know, we don't think everything's okay. Come back, do more testing, excavate more stuff. Currently ongoing, there is a Superfund restoration happening on 18 Mile Creek in Lockport. So I know that the creek names around here kind of get confusing because there's 18 Mile Creek down in Hamburg, and then there's also 18 Mile Creek in Lockport, and they are two different bodies of water. They are named. So anytime you see a creek around here, this is very much an aside, but anytime you see a creek around here with some number mile in its name, so 18 mile, 12 mile, 4 mile, etc., that mile number refers to how many miles the mouth of that river is from either the top of the Niagara River or the bottom of the Niagara River. So 18 Mile Creek in Lockport, where this creek empties out into Lake Ontario, that point in Lake Ontario is 18 miles from where the Niagara River meets up with Lake Ontario. 18 Mile Creek in Hamburg, the mouth of the 18 Mile Creek in Hamburg, 18 miles from the start of the Niagara River, like where they put the ice booms and where the roundhouse out in the middle of the lake where they suck up water for the city of Buffalo is. So that's how those rivers are named. But anyway, 18 Mile Creek in Lockport is the one that they're currently rehabbing, right where 18 Mile kind of comes out from underneath the Erie Canal. There used to be a lot of chemical plants there using PCBs, using lead, and they are currently dredging and excavating the whole headwaters of the creek. And you can actually drive by the site and kind of look as you drive. It's quite impressive what they're doing so far. It's a massive construction site, but you can still see the water flowing, and it's going to be really good when it's all done in a couple of years. All right. And so with that concludes my introduction to you guys for PFAS. So what we're going to do next time is we're going to do a jigsaw activity. So there is a paper that I posted on Blackboard that you guys need to have read by Tuesday. And what we're going to do in class on Tuesday is I'm going to put you guys into groups, and these groups are going to be at first in charge of talking about a particular section, and then we're going to mix up the groups so that you can all talk to each other about each of the sections, and then we'll kind of go through the paper and summarize it for all of us and really figure out what was going on in that paper. So just to show you guys where that is, since we have some time. Sorry, this is very ad hoc, so I didn't have it ready to go. Just so that you guys know, because I know folks have been asking and wondering what's going on with this jigsaw thing. Okay, so here in the scientific literature, so this is the first paper that we're going to read. This is about the ski wax and the pine needles. And we are going to be doing this worksheet. So this is where you guys will be in groups talking about sort of individual parts of the paper separately. And then we're going to mix up the groups again so that at least one person in the group has read at least one part of the paper, that you can all talk to each other about all the parts of the paper. And then we'll all come together and we'll sort of talk about our takeaways and important bits and things we noticed about the paper. And kind of have a little journal club that way. So this, I will have copies of this in class for you guys, so you don't need to print this out or bring it pre-filled or anything. The filling out of this worksheet is part of the in-class activity. So if you come with it kind of pre-filled, then you almost can't, because like these questions are like, here's a point I shared with my group. If you come with this beforehand, I'm gonna be like, you didn't talk to anybody about this. So something you learned from your group, right? You have to have talked to somebody in the group to hear what they had to say about that section. So this is an in-class activity. If folks end up being absent, we might have to think of some makeup alternatives. But again, these aren't worth terribly many points, and there's only going to be 4 of them. So hopefully not that big a deal. This is something new that I'm trying, and so it may change and mutate as we go forward, but we'll see how it goes to start. But that's the jigsaw activity. So it's that handout based on this paper. That this should be the full scientific paper with their nice little graphical abstract. Please do read more than just the abstract. And in case you forget to read that, I do have a reminder here. Please have read that paper by Tuesday. All right, so that's what we're doing. That's the plan. And hopefully all of these sort of special topics will go like this, where we'll have a day of introduction and then we'll have a day of reading the paper. All right, and so with that, I don't have anything else to say, and I'm not sure if Zoom captured any of that or not, or they were just staring at the thing for all this time. But yeah, that's the end of the day.